Okay, so just a brief introduction of myself, if someone doesn't know me. So I work for Japan Global Gateway. Basically, I work in the personal data empowerment area. So I'm a Personium chief evangelist, which means I promote Personium, which is the open source platform of personal data store software in Japan. And I also work on ethical personal data solutions that I kind of give consulting advice to Japanese company that contact us in Fujitsu. And I'm also SDG enabler. So several things I've been working on related to personal data. It's Chow online workshop, things like that. So, and I'm also a board member of 2021 and 2022 of My Data Global, which is very innovative data-related global community. So we have roughly 3,000 participants in Slack and 500 active members. So hopefully, if you have anything you want to listen from the webinar, please contact me, and I'll bring in more innovative people. So okay, yeah, and now I'll give the floor to Jeff. Go ahead.
Great, really appreciate the invitation, Dixon, and hopefully we can have a good discussion here today. Let me do the screen share. Hopefully we can get this rolling. All right. Okay, can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Should be a couple of squares. And I think I've got everything set up to do the right presentation. Great. Well, I am Jeff Jockisch, as Dixon said. I'm a CIPP US and a data privacy researcher. I have my own company called Privacy Plan, where I'm the CEO. It's just a sort of boutique consulting company. And I primarily do independent data privacy research and consult with companies large and small. I'm also the lead data steward at the Data Collaboration Alliance, which is a nonprofit that focuses on a variety of different things, but primarily zero copy initiatives, where we try to promote access and not copies for a variety of different initiatives. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later if we have time. And then I'm also the co-host of a weekly privacy show podcast called Your Bytes, Your Rights, where we focus on data ownership and data privacy. So let me sort of move forward here. That is not working. Hopefully this will. There we go. Okay, so the agenda today is to essentially sort of talk about sensitive data across culture, and if we have some time, we'll talk a little bit about data privacy and data science and data collaboration. So let's sort of get into the meat of the discussion here. I do want to say, sort of before we get going, that I want to try to make this as interactive as we can. Hopefully we can get some participation from you folks. And I'm willing to answer questions sort of at any point here. So if you have questions, please type them into the chat or frankly, just speak up so we can have an interactive session here today. So sensitive data across cultures, I want to first sort of give you a little bit of a background. If we think about sensitive data, sensitive personal information, it requires a little bit of context. Privacy laws have been around for a while, but sensitive data itself is a little bit different. It first really popped up in the OECD guidelines in 1980, but there were no real categories discussed in that implementation. A year later in the Council of Europe discussions, they actually did start to break out some categories, and the UN guidelines fleshed them out even a little bit further. And then the DPT directive in 1995 had a little bit some changes, and then finally things sort of really started getting going past that. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. When you start to sort of compare how people thought about sensitive personal information, there are a lot of sort of differences. And so if you look at sort of the yellow colorations here, you can see the differences between the COE in 1981 and the UN definitions in 1990. And there's some relatively big differences, right? Racial origin ethnic origin was not included in the COE definitions. They included criminal convictions, but not philosophical beliefs. They included health data, but not membership in trade organizations or color. So those are some pretty, big differences. If you go later down here and sort of compare the European DPD to GDPR, not a whole lot of differences between those two, because this was just sort of an evolution here. But throwing in genetic data and biometric data is a pretty big transition, I think. So we're seeing some evolution here happening in that sort of 10-year time span. If you want to look at this in sort of a larger context, this is a really complicated chart that I put out. Actually, I've been working on it for a while, but the latest iteration came out about a month ago. And I probably need to walk through this a little bit to give you some context. But this looks at sort of 4 different trends here. At the top, it looks at data privacy laws here, data privacy legislation, and sort of in 3 different waves. It's a little US-centric, but sort of focuses on sort of a first wave of early privacy legislation, a second wave of privacy legislation, and then sort of our current wave of privacy legislation. And it sort of shows you that in comparison to information technology trend here in this sort of red trend line, right? And what I sort of call a third trend line of surveillance capitalism that's going on here, and a fourth trend line that sort of hugs that one, called data breach trend line. And you can sort of see how, when you look at this all in context, how the privacy legislation sort of mirrors or maybe follows a lot of these technology trends. But if you also look at sort of the blue circled privacy laws up here, this is where we started talking about sensitive data. And so I think that maybe gives you a little bit more perspective on how privacy laws are sort of happening and how we sort of started talking about sensitive personal information. After the EU DPD law, there were several other international laws that started talking about sensitive data, and that's really sort of expanded greatly since that point. And that's what we're going to start talking about now. We maybe need a little bit more context, though. I think it's probably clear to everybody, right, that there's sort of like this big bucket of all data. As a subset of that, we have personal information, and as a subset of that, we have sensitive personal information, right? If you think about PI, personal information, and try to break that down, I like to categorize things as a, I don't really call myself a data scientist, but I do some data science. And I think categorization and taxonomy is just crucial to what we do. One of the most important things about personal information is that personal information a personal identifier, directly or indirectly? Another way to think about personal information is, how is it collected? And this is sort of crucially important outside of Europe, because inside of Europe, we sort of think about Europe and maybe the rest of the world. We think about personal data as sort of like a human right. And in the United States, we sort of think of it as more of a, I'm sort of blanking here, so I lost my train of thought. The data is more of a a property right or a different type of right, not necessarily a human right. And so that sort of contributes to a little bit of the problem with how sorry, am I sort of losing my thread here a little bit?
No problem. Take your time.
Sorry, gentlemen. Let me back up here a second. So if you think about how data is collected and created, there are, I think, at least 5 different ways you can sort of think about that, right? The information that's contributed directly by a data subject, right? So I go into an to a form and I submit my name, my address, my email, things like that, right? Then there are things that a company can observe what I do. So I mouse around on a form, I click an ad, I do X, I do Y. Those are observed actions. There's also third-party data that some company could buy about me and add to my profile. Then there's inferred information about me that this company can make. They can say, oh, well, this guy likes sports, or he likes cats, or he likes movies about Keanu Reeves, right? And then they can take that information about me and they can build algorithms. All of these are different types of information that can be collected about me. And each of those different pieces of information could potentially be bucketed in different ways and claimed to be different types of personal information with different rights. So let's say that all of these pieces of information were about Dixon. When a privacy law is written, Dixon might have ownership of all of this personal data, or he might have ownership of none of this personal information. Generally, a privacy law, I think in Europe, like GDPR, might say that all of this information is Dixon's. A privacy law like the Utah privacy law, which says that that he has the right to access this information through the data subject access rights, I think only gives him the right to grab the information that he contributed directly. I'm pretty sure that it only allows him the company, if he does a delete request, the company only has to delete the information that Dixon contributed directly to that company. He may be able to actually access a larger subset of that information, like maybe the observed actions and the third-party data. But when he does a delete request, he can only delete, I believe, the information that he contributed directly. Right? So how this information is collected and how it's sort of put into different buckets is sort of extremely important, especially in at least American jurisprudence. So how sensitive personal information is broken down is a little bit different, and I think that's why I sort of wanted to sort of point out this differentiation. Right? So let's sort of get to the study that I did. When I started to categorize sensitive personal information, I broke it up into these buckets: beliefs, origins, health, sex life, membership, social status, finances, children's data, biometric, genetic, location, and unique IDs. And you'll notice that these buckets are actually previously, because the countries that have implemented sensitive personal information laws have actually gone beyond what those categories are so far that we've talked about. When I sort of surveyed 20 different laws that are on the books internationally and in the US and internationally, here's sort of what I found. This is a sort of quick overview here. I'm going to sort of show you the larger group in a second, but if you look at the laws that have the most frequency, 16 of those 20 laws had a carve out for religious beliefs. And another 16 also focused on racial origin, and 15 covered ethnic origin, and 14 covered health, some sort of physical health or diagnosis. 12 covered political belief. 12 covered sexual life. 9 covered trade union or labor union membership. And 9 covered sexual orientation. And then 7 covered genetic or biometric data. If we go and actually take a look at the sort of full picture, I think I can zoom in on this a little bit further. Maybe not. Thought I was going to be able to do that for you guys, but apparently that's not going to do that for us. Well, this full chart will be available to you after the meeting, but you can actually sort of see here. Maybe I can do it this way. Oh, there we go. Great. So you can actually see here that this sort of breaks down and actually goes into detail, but you've got countries here that are covering things that are a lot different. And so that in different countries, like some countries cover ideological beliefs, moral beliefs and conscience. A few countries cover financial data. California covers unique IDs like Social Security number. Saudi Arabia covers intellectual beliefs. Australia covers biometric templates, not just biometric data. Kenya covers property details under finance. Saudi Arabia covers location data in a particular way. China covers location tracking. Kenya covers family details, children and parents and spouses. Marital status is covered by Kenya as well. Clothing is covered by Turkey. So there are some really interesting things that are covered as sensitive personal information that are very specific to specific laws in countries. Let's go back here and take a look at the next slide. We can also sort of break this up into a little bit different ways. So I looked at this in a couple of different sort of breakouts. So we can also sort of break this up into these categories. So if we look at just beliefs, for instance, you can see sort of religious beliefs, political beliefs, philosophical beliefs, general personal opinions, ideological, moral, intellectual, right? If you want to look at biometrics, you can see biometric and genetic information is covered here, but some locations only covered for like uniquely identifying an individual, or biometric information for verification and ID, or biometric templates, right? For children's data, some is for a known child, and some is for personal data of minors less than 14. So there are nuances to each of these things, and we can take a look at that in a little bit more detail as well. So if we wanted to look at, for instance, trade union membership, it has sort of different logistics. Can I get to that? Anyway, there's lots of detail here. So like race and origin, or ethnic origin, or marital status. So this just sort of shows you how sort of I've grouped these things together if you're interested in that sort of level of detail. Any questions about this? I'm sort of going through this a little bit fast and maybe a little bit too quickly.
It's okay for me. Anyone else want to ask questions?
this is a little bit of the summary here, right? Some of the new and interesting types of defined special data that I thought was most interesting. You know, marital status in Kenya is sort of called out, tribal origin in Saudi Arabia, clothing in Turkey, criminal prosecutions in Benin, specially designated status in China, driver's license and other IDs in California. I didn't have this in the study, but this popped up just recently. If you may have seen this, there's a court case that your marital partner's name is now considered special category data in the EU, because they can, you know, if my spouse's name, first name, for instance, is Fred, then you could probably infer that I was gay, right? So your spouse's name, it can give away the fact that you have a particular sexual inclination, right? So the EU has essentially ruled that your partner name is special category data. So there are lots of things that are interesting here in terms of what qualifies as special category data. I'm not sure if all of you folks know, if you're all privacy professionals, but PIPEDA, the Canadian law, covers special category data, but they don't actually call out any data at all. All the law really says is that any piece of data in combination with any other piece of data, if it allows you to infer something about somebody that is sensitive, then it's considered sensitive. Sorry, brain's a little bit slow this morning.
Yeah. Hi, Jeff. In the chat, Sachin asked about how about habits or behavior in social media. Can those be considered as sensitive data in some country, or be considered at all?
Behavior in social media?
Yeah, and also habits. Yeah.
I haven't seen actual behavior in social media, but I'm sure that the application of whatever information you found there could be. I did actually, sorry, after I sort of did my study, I didn't even know that this other study existed, but there's a 2017 study by Wang and Zhang that they did a study of SPI. I didn't even know this existed until actually a couple of days ago when I was prepping for this, right? And they did this study called the Defining Approaches and Practical Paradox of Sensitive Data. And they actually looked at like 92 different laws around, and they actually went through, I forget what they did. I think it was the DLA Piper law book, and essentially analyzed their analysis of sensitive data laws, or all privacy laws, and how they sort of covered sensitive data and sort of put stuff together. But they actually had a bunch of other things down here that I didn't even cover: abnormal addiction, age, child adoption, creditworthiness. So some of these things are actually covered in laws that I didn't look at, and are also apparently covered in some like laws that I didn't look at that are also covered as sensitive information. So home address, registered domicile, a personal email address, student data. So there are so many different things that are covered as special category or sensitive personal information. Depending upon where you're doing business, like virtually everything seems to me can be considered sensitive information, depending upon what you're doing with it, right? And that, we're going to talk about the implications of this here in a moment, right? But that can be a lot. Right? So, is there another question, or was it just about social media?
One about social media, and the other one is habits. But I think habits is also, for my opinion, currently it won't be identifier, because if you like doll doesn't mean that you have to be a girl anymore, right? So probably that's kind of gray area. So you cannot
Yeah.
use habits to define anything, in this kind of social society now, I think. What
Yeah.
do you think?
Ask me again here.
Oh yeah, Sachin also asked another question. It's habits of some person can be a sensitive data at all.
Are you talking about like addictive habits or just things that people do?
Maybe just habits. Yeah, it didn't put addictive there. Sachin, if you
Yeah,
want to ask directly, yeah.
it's just like a whatever your behavior shows or whatever your habits are in particularly in particular any search engine, for example, if you are searching for a sports, so immediately you will see that a lot of sports related links will flood into your Facebook or wherever whichever social media you are working on or using daily.
Mhm.
Well,
Uh,
I think this is a good philosophical question, right? So,
for example, somebody is searching for a critical medicine. So they
Mhm.
may attribute even for a social cause, but somebody may attribute that that particular disease is associated with that person, and all of
right,
a sudden you'll get information bombarded into his mailbox or Facebook account for that matter.
Yeah,
right,
that's true. Yeah.
right. I don't think it matters the mechanism, right? So your search history might or might not be special category data depending upon what you're searching for, right?
True, true, true.
Um,
But when I particularly work in Japan region, so whatever attributed to a person, they call it PII, personally identifiable information. So
mhm.
that term is pretty vague, and anything that can be linked to a person, it can be categorized as PII information. That's why I was a little curious to understand what is spatial data here, or does it qualify as a spatial data?
Yeah. So I think you're drawing a good inference, right? So personally identifiable information has that sort of vagueness to it as well, right? And I think that special category data or special sensitive personal information has that same kind of nuance to it that is extremely hard to define. And that's actually what I was trying to allude to in the previous slide that I did not do a very good job on. Um,
Hey, no, no, you did a very good job. There were some additional queries from my side. Thanks.
yeah. Well, I think that maybe we should move sort of here to the next slide. This is actually just some links to the live spreadsheet. If you guys want to take a look at this and to the LinkedIn post that I made about this data that we've sort of just walked through, in case you're interested later. But I want to sort of talk a little bit more about what the implications are, right? So this is sort of what we're getting into now. So how should we think about these definitions, right? How is a new item added to the list of sensitive personal information? What is sensitive about the data, right? Are some data more sensitive than others? If you think about it, right, is your sex life more personal than your race? Does it depend upon the person what the sensitivity is? It might a rich white person think that that their health and financial data are more sensitive than race and family origin, right? We talk about sensitive personal information like it's an on-off switch, but is it really that, or is it some kind of a sliding scale? And does that sliding scale vary by person, right? I mean, does gender matter to me more or less than it might to a woman, right? Who thinks that gender equality is more important because it's affecting her more, right? Or might race be more important to someone who's not white, right? I think that's probably pretty obvious. And so how should we think about these things, and does it matter? I think it does. And I think that the fact that we think about special category data and sensitive personal information as an on-off switch is probably the wrong way to think about it. But what could we do about that? Could we think about it in a different way? Could we have levels of sensitive personal information? And if we did, what would that mean? Could we have extremely sensitive personal information? Should levels of sensitive personal information impact how things are stored? Fines companies should get, should that data be breached? That's pretty interesting, huh?
Yeah, I would say it's interesting in a way that, from my own experience, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Jeff. It's
No, go ahead.
if the same person, if the same question is asked to me where I'm from, whether I'm facing Japanese or facing European or whatever, my answer will be different, just in order to protect myself. As some people might know, that I was born in Vietnam and then I live in Hong Kong, but I also have a Canadian passport. So if I find some kind of anti-Asian attitude from that person, then I'll tell them that right away that, hey, I'm Canadian. But then then if I find them they're kind of friendly to the to China or whatever, then I'll tell them I'm from Hong Kong. So same person, same questions, but then it will be different answer. Like, it's kind of cool, like in my own way, that okay, so I do it differently. So that might be also affecting what I think is sensitive at all. So that's my own experience. Sorry to interrupt you.
I think that's insightful. It's interesting. Let's think about this. Let's think about the question that you guys answered when you signed up for the survey. If you had to choose, what type of sensitive personal information do you think would be most important to protect? Information about your nature, things that you can change, or information about your choices? I mean, these are both like intrinsically sensitive personal information, right? Your religion, your politics, your location, or your biometrics, your race, your ethnicity. I mean, you can change, I guess, your religion and your politics and your location, but those are still pretty hard to change, right? Are you going to move? Are you going to really change your religion and change your politics? I mean, if we looked at those things that are most protected on the survey that I did, these are the ones that are most protected, right? These are ones were less protected and more recently protected, I think, right? I guess race was one of the top ones, right? Race and ethnicity, right? But biometrics was a newer one, and family tree is only protected by a couple of laws. These were the ones that, well, politics and religion are the ones that were more, I guess race and religion were probably the two, right? But it's interesting, right? Here's how you guys voted if you're interested. So more people were talking about information about your nature rather than your choices, but it's a tough choice. So really, sensitive personal information is about protecting both of those things. So maybe it's sort of a false dichotomy, but I thought it was an interesting question to raise because I think it's really about both of these things. Any thoughts on this from the audience? Maybe it's just, I mean, I think it probably is just a false dichotomy, but I thought it was an interesting way to sort of think about this because, like I said, I think taxonomy and trying to categorize these things gives us a lot of insight into this types of data. So let me sort of give you some insight that I have some personal thoughts, right? And I don't know that this really helps us entirely think about how to think about sensitive personal information, but I would put forward this thought for your consideration. Sensitive personal information is data that could allow someone to separate us, discriminate against us, and/or violate our human dignity. Now, that doesn't always happen, right? And it might happen to some of us more than others of us. But I think that's really what sensitive personal information gets toward. And so when you look at any piece of personal data, could that information be used against us? That's really what I think sensitive personal information is about. And the problem is that if you start to think about it, what information could be weaponized against us? If I like Keanu Reeves movies, is there some way that somebody could use that against me? It doesn't seem very likely now, right? But I don't know. I mean, could that somehow be used against me at some point? I don't know. What if, I mean, there are things like, oh, what if, okay, what if I like handguns? Could that be used against me? Probably could in the United States, because if I like handguns, I'm probably more likely to be a Republican, which means now they know my political bent, right? So there are lots of proxy variables that, based upon likes and dislikes, you might be able to figure out about someone. Just like, and there are proxy variables in other things. So for instance, zip code in the United States will tell you a whole lot about someone's income bracket, right? So you can't use zip code generally in a lot of analyses, because it's going to tell you about, someone's, how much money someone makes. And, any thoughts on this? This is the way I think about sensitive personal information. The problem is, right, if this is the definition, so much information that we think of as personal information can really be sensitive personal information. And if you combine a couple of different things, pieces of personal information, lots of things can be sensitive personal information.
Jeff, Daniel here has a question.
Sure.
Could personal sensitive data also be used to benefit us? For example, taking my family health data to predict health conditions in certain demographics.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that we have to be able to use sensitive personal information, Daniel. There is no doubt that while it can be used against us, it can be used for the good of us as well. I'm not suggesting that we can't collect this information. I'm just saying that it's sensitive. I think that, I mean, I guess to repeat myself, yes, we have to collect it in a lot of cases. We just have to be very careful with it. And let's talk about some of the implications here. I think that's what we're going to talk about next, right? Yeah, right. So what are the implications for handling sensitive data? I think that privacy laws are still new to us in the world. I mean, it's been around for, what, 30 years now? More. 1970s, if we sort of think about it. So that's like 70s, it's like 50 years we've had privacy laws, right? But while they're still getting a lot of, scrutiny and public support, the real focus, right, where we get a lot of impact is in children's data and sensitive data. Those are where I think we get more impact from those laws. And that's not really surprising, I guess, right? If you think about it, those areas are expanding faster than other privacy laws. And part of that reason is because I think it's easier to enforce those laws. And if you think about it, right, those particular laws are often opt-in or have higher levels of security and control, right? And so while it's sometimes hard to pass a privacy law, once you get that law in place, you can control the data more effectively if it's categorized as children's data or sensitive data. And so I think part of the, I don't know that it's necessarily privacy advocates pushing this, right? But the more types of data that you can classify as children's data or sensitive data, the wider, the more control over the data sphere that can actually happen, if that makes any sense, right? If you look at the second part of the slide here, so what does that actually mean, right? For companies, right? You have to review your data labeling and data mapping, right? All of those policies, all those processes, because you have to think about if something is going to be sensitive data or children's data for that matter, right? Do you need consent? Do you have the right disposal processes in place? Do you require special handling, special storage, right? Special encryption? And overall, how are you going to handle this data to stay ahead of the curve? Are you going to take the strictest approach? Are you going to take every single piece of data that we just sort of talked about that could be special category data or sensitive data and, you know, consider it sensitive? Or are you going to try to geofence it by location, which is probably going to be a nightmare, right? Complicated.
Jeff, can I
go ahead.
Here? Yeah, two questions. One, it's could we be working towards a global or universal set of legislation to protect us against misuse of sensitive data? So, what do you think about it? Yeah.
Should we have a global rule?
Yeah, a global legislation. So I think it's hard myself with GDPR, CCPR. So it's culturally it's different, right? But what about your thoughts?
Well, I think it's a good idea. Will it ever happen? I mean, I think it's pretty unlikely, right? But yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, good, good.
I mean, I think the closer you might get is something like a UN rule on it. But yeah, I think it's a great thought.
Yeah. I think with the UNICEF or UN guideline, that's okay. And then afterwards, each country adopt to the as the localized with the culture or like you said, different sensitive data categories. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And the second question, it's interesting. Like I think it's all depend on the consent and permission of using the data.
Right.
Lockender kind of ask. What if same information is used by insurance or to charge a person higher premium, as that person may be more vulnerable to some argument based on family history? There's a higher risk of misuse of information for business benefit than benefiting the humanity. So what's your thought on that?
Well, I think there's no doubt that companies are going to misuse sensitive data in this way. They're definitely doing it now.
Yeah.
And it's definitely illegal. The question is, how do you stop them?
Mm-hmm.
Because the information is pretty ubiquitous. And it's hard to prove that they used a particular piece of information to set a particular rate. So we know it's happening and we know it's illegal, but how do we stop it? I don't know.
Yeah. I guess it's more changing the mindset of the employee. It's kind of like one of the active group in Fujitsu UK, led by Peter Chow. I think he's just drop off, but he kind of work on the AI ethics, so that try to make the solution more ethical from the company's point of view. So it's trying to like not being forced by the law, but doing it by their own like good heart, do no evil thing. So probably that's the thing that we can count on. That's what I think. Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, the insurance industry, I mean, they're trying to figure out what the risk profile is, and if they've got a data point that says that somebody's more risky or less risky, they're going to use it, right? Unless they've got a competitor who's going to take that customer away from them by offering a better rate, because that other competitor has better information. There's no reason that they're going to change their ways, and that other competitor has got to have better data that says that that same customer has a lower risk profile that actually is a lower risk profile, right? And but if the data is actually true, that's not going to hold up in the long run. So, you know, if the data is actually true, that doesn't really work in the real market, right? So, anyway, I don't know that I want to go through this one, but I maybe point out here real quick one other quick point. There's a lawsuit going on right now, Meta versus I don't even know if I can pronounce that. Bunder, I can't pronounce that, but let's say it's C252, right? This case with Meta Platforms. This part of this is about sensitive data. You might want to check out this post from Omar Tene, who's used to be with the IAPP. He's now with a big law firm. He talks about some sensitive data triggers. I think this is really pretty interesting if you're in the law side of sensitive data. So you may want to check that out if that's your thing. Otherwise, one other quick thing to note is we're sort of running out of time, but you might want to think about this concept of ownership design. We're watching personal data ownership being sort of reshaped. And there's a book called Mine, M-I-N-E, exclamation point. The Hidden Rules of Ownership, How Ownership Controls Our Lives, by UCLA law professor, actually a couple of law professors, but one of the professors is James Saltzman. And it's really interesting. It talks about how there are sort of like different rules of ownership, like first come, first served, and things like that, that are sort of embedded in how we decide who owns things. And when it was a sort of an analog world, it was very easy, not easy, but it was easier to sort of understand who owned things. But now that we're in a digital world, it's much more complicated. And companies like Amazon and Google and stuff like that are sort of much more easily able to redefine who owns things, like a book, right? It used to be very simple to understand who owned a book, but now a digital book is a lot different, right? You don't necessarily own a digital book the same way you own a physical book. And the same is true for our data. So if you're interested in ownership of personal information, you might want to check out this book. It's very enlightening, let's say. But that's sort of it for that part and the most important part of the presentation. So I'll sort of stop here and ask again if you've got any questions about that. The other parts are just sort of ancillary, and we can go into that or not, since we're sort of about out of time. Any other questions about the sensitive personal information anybody wants to go into?
Zeph,
Oh, go ahead.
sorry. You have something to ask, Dixon?
Oh, no.
May-
I was
okay.
trying to say something about Carlos' comments, but go ahead.
Okay. Zeph, I have one scenario which I would like to bring here and would like hear your views also.
Sure.
Very recently, I have seen I have switched off all my audio services on my mobile so that by default they are not active. They must be active while I use that particular application. So that kind of feature I adopted. But recently, I have seen when I was just discussing something and suddenly, without touching my phone, my uh, Google voice command started finding the search based on I was just doing the conversation, though that services were off. So how we can trust? How we
Hmm.
can trust our mobile device these days? What if they are listening us all through the day?
It's a good question. Yeah, I don't know about that particular incident. I know a lot of people think that their devices are listening to them. There is actually an interesting, I guess, answer to some of that. You know how you maybe talk to Dixon about a topic. Maybe you're talking about apple carts, and then you go back and all of a sudden you see ads about apple carts. And a lot of people think that's because their phones are listening. There's actually an interesting ad tech thing that's going on, and it's not that your phones are listening. It's what actually is going on is when you are having a conversation with somebody. One of the things that happens is the ad tech companies can tell that you're having a conversation with Dixon because your phone is next to his for a long time, for a period of time, right? And it could be that Dixon searched for apple carts, right, recently, right?
Yep.
And now you and he are having a conversation about apple carts, right? And you talked to him about apple carts, right? So now the ad tech companies know that you and Dixon had a conversation, and they know that Dixon talked about apple carts. So now you go home, right, and the next day you start seeing ads for apple carts. You think, right, that they overheard your conversation, but actually what they did is linked his profile to your profile and started showing you ads for the things that he liked because they knew you were near him.
Understand. I get that point.
Yeah. But no, people don't realize that's one thing that happens. So it's not necessarily that your phone is listening, but that doesn't mean that your phone's not listening either, right?
Yeah. No, this is very recent. I was just driving my vehicle and I was in the conversation. My device was not running any application. Suddenly it started searching something based on the conversation I was having. So I was surprised because I am very careful in setting up my device in terms of from the privacy standpoint.
Yeah, I wonder if there's some way that you triggered the keyword, because mine will do that occasionally too. But I generally turn the damn thing off. I don't have any of the voice assistants on either.
Yeah, it's scary. Yeah, I agree.
So in the chat, I just share a story. Actually, it's two parts, part one, part two. Everyone can check it. And Amade was so nice to create her own YouTube video to explain how the robotic toys or AI toys that keep listening to what the children is saying when they're playing, and then they will use it for whatever recommendation, analysis or whatever. So it's kind of scary, but then probably we can stop it using law or whatever. But just be careful when you buy a Alexa or anything, smart speakers.
For sure.
Yeah. So yeah, we have 3 minutes left, and anyone want to ask Jeff directly? So last questions that you guys can have. Otherwise, if you want to talk to him more, then please contact him through LinkedIn. So any last questions? If not, then I don't see anyone raising hand. So if not, then maybe Jeff, you can finish up next topics you wanted to, if you can finish it within 2 minutes.
Yeah, we
It's
haven't
very
got much
complicated.
time.
Yeah.
I'll just point to a couple of slides here that you guys can look at if you want to look over the slides. I do a bunch of different projects. There's links to a bunch of them here. I sort of study data brokers and privacy laws and privacy regulators, and there's a bunch of different data sets here that you can access. The data broker one you can't actually access, but all the other ones you can. So there's a bunch of things here. This is one that I was going to show you on that I sort of did that I thought was pretty interesting on state privacy law, resident triggers. There's all of these US laws here have laws that essentially say that you have to have a minimum of 10,000 residents in order to trigger the law. But because the states have different amounts of population, that translates into much different types of data breaches, right? So if a company actually has, a company has to have a whole lot more customers in order to essentially trigger those kinds of things. So a national business with how many customers would actually likely trigger that law, right? So if there was a data breach of a company that had like 846,000 customers, it would probably trigger the California law. But that same company would actually have to have like 10 million customers in order to trigger the Utah law, right? Based upon the numbers that sort of worked out here. So it sounds like these laws, based upon having a 10,000 limit, you have to have 10,000 customers in Utah, for instance, or in California in order to trigger the data breach notification law. Sounds like it's like a similar law, right? Because it is the same trigger, but it's really not. You essentially have to have you have to have a 10 times more massive data breach in order for it to actually trigger the Utah law than it would the California law. See what I'm saying? So sometimes when laws actually have the same wording in them, they're not actually the same in terms of like how sensitive they are. That was an interesting look. Anyway, actually that's click through. That wasn't what I was trying to show you. Anyway, we're over time, so I will shut up.
Thank you, and thanks again, Jeff. And there's one last comment. Having different local laws in different countries make it difficult to follow them, specifically when the world is becoming a global village. That's Lokender's comments. Thank you, Lokender. So some guy has to drop off. So let me see if there's any other last minute. No. Okay. So that's all. So everyone who joined this or registered to this webinar, I'll share the video and also the slide. Since most of the people in the Europe region, they cannot access Google directly. So I'll just export Jeff's presentation into PDF and then share it by email. So please don't worry, everyone. So, and when the video is ready, I'll double check it if it's okay. Then probably no one ever speak about in the chat also, no confidential information. So I'll be able to share it with you, Jeff, in 1 or 2 days after it finish encoding in my computer.
Great, perfect.
So it's
thank
kind
you,
of slow.
Dixon.
So,
thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jeff, again, and hope that if it's anyone want to hear from you again, then they can contact you directly or contact me so that we can have a second workshop.
Great.
Thank you, everyone,
Take care,
for joining,
everyone.
and thank you, Jeff.
Bye.
Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you all. Bye. Thank you. Bye.